The Isle of Man really is such an inspiring place. My name's Tim Price, I'm a composer, and I find loads of inspiration in the Manx landscape. There's so much contrast and variety. You've got the glens and rivers, the hills and the heaths. There are different types of coastline, flat and sandy or rugged rocky cliffs, salt marshes, and loads more. And all of this is packed into a fairly small space. I first came up with the idea of composing a piece inspired by the natural beauty of the island about 4 or 5 years ago. I've been sketching ideas for the piece since then, but 2020 gave me a really great chance to actually get the piece finished. The places and features I've chosen for the 7 movements represent some of the natural variety that's packed into this small island. I've tried to use a rich instrumental and harmonic palette to create a piece that depicts something of the beauty, the diversity and the atmosphere of these natural features. For the Ayres, I wanted to create a sense of the openness of this long stretch of sandy coast. The combination of sustained violin harmonics behind a solo violin really creates that effect, and it seemed like the perfect opening for this piece. The music in this movement is also quite modal. There are echoes of a Vaughan Williams type of sound, and there's something about the sound of those kind of harmonies that really seemed suitable for this landscape. Sometimes when I compose, I use a system that I developed to turn words or phrases into patterns of notes. Composers such as Bach, Schumann and Shostakovich have all written music using patterns of notes that spell either their own name or part of their name. I decided to take this idea further, to give every letter of the alphabet an equivalent musical note. In Gem of God's Earth, I've used this concept in a variety of different ways to inspire ideas that were linked to the names of some of those places. When composing the melody for the Ayres, I took the 5 notes generated from the word Ayres and used these as anchor notes to build the rest of the melody around. Much of the music in this movement is based around this melody. Ballaglass is a beautiful glen, known for its waterfalls and swathes of bluebells, as well as stunning autumn colour. Although there are sections in this movement that sound quite relaxed and peaceful, there are also a lot of faster passages, inspired by the movement of the river. I was often thinking about the way that the water bubbles and splashes over the smaller waterfalls. It has quite a fun, playful sound, but it has some serious moments too. There's an interesting harmonic idea in this movement that all stems from the name Ballaglass. The notes that came from that were just a collection of Bs, As, Gs and G sharps, which isn't that interesting in itself, but it did lead me to the idea of juxtaposing 2 unrelated chords of G major, which uses G and B, and E major, which uses G sharp and B. The main melody uses G natural as a root note, but it modulates halfway through to E major. To help this transition, the melody itself is based on a Lydian mode on G, rather than the G major scale. The brighter sound of this scale, with its sharpened fourth note, helps to smooth out this transition. It also gives the melody a more playful character. This juxtaposition of G major and E major is also used in a variety of other ways throughout the movement. Langness is a fascinating area with lots of variety. It's been designated as an area of special scientific interest because of all the different habitats like the salt marsh and the rock pools and the interesting geology and the rare species that can be found on the peninsula. As you start to travel out along Langness, the first impression you get is of how long and flat it looks. But as you explore, you see these big dramatic rocks on both sides, and you can really imagine the way the sea would crash against them in rough weather. In between, there are areas of heath and grassland. I've tried to reflect all of this in the music. It starts with a very soft, sustained idea played by the bassoons and the cor anglais, but later on this idea is transformed and the music around it all sounds much more dramatic. There's also a bit more dissonance in this movement. At first I thought that this would be suitable for the salt marsh at the start. It's an area that's also known to birdwatchers as Stinky Dub because of the smell of the seaweed. But these kinds of harmonies also seem to suit the large rocks that are found further on. Contrasting with both of these ideas, there are lyrical melodies that could represent other aspects, like the heath or the grassland. For the Curraghs, I wanted to create something that sounded a bit mysterious at times. If you walk through the wooded area of Close Sartfield, a nature reserve in the Curraghs, you see all these twisted trees. Some of them are covered in lichen and ivy. Sometimes you'll hear things like the branches creaking, but it can be difficult to see things through the trees. It can almost feel like visiting another country, especially with the chance of seeing a wallaby. I've added a subtle reference to this in the form of some low notes on the bass clarinet and bassoons, a sort of imitation of the didgeridoo. I also wanted to imitate the sound of birdsong. There's a section where individuals from the upper string sections and the high woodwind play short phrases that are actually transcriptions of real bird songs, slowed down to make them more playable. I was trying to create something that felt like being surrounded by birds singing in the trees. The main melody in this movement is based on the pattern of notes that comes from the name Curraghs. It doesn't form a full scale, but no matter how you fill the gaps, the sound is much closer to a modal scale than a major or minor. This can add to the mysterious sound of the darker sections, but it can also take on a much brighter sound in others, where I was thinking about the wild flower meadows and especially the orchards that Close Sartfield is famous for. The Chasms was one of the first movements in the suite to really come together, although I hadn't properly been there until after I finished the music. I wanted to write something big and dramatic, inspired by the idea of these steep cliffs and the large rock formations on the coast around this part of the island. There are these great fissures, and in places you can look through them right down to sea level. There's a short staccato phrase that runs through much of this movement in various forms. The initial pattern of notes comes from the word chasms. Most of the melodic material is developed from one motif, which is rather angular, a bit like the rocks. The idea is transformed throughout the movement to create a range of different moods. Sometimes it's dark and ominous, sometimes it's grand and majestic. When I finally got to explore the chasms, I had this music in mind, and it really did seem to me to reflect something of the drama and of how dangerous this place could be. Although most of the movements in Gem of God's Earth are based on places and habitats, I also wanted to include something to recognise the island's dark skies. The Isle of Man is a great place for astronomy. Lower levels of light pollution mean that we get great views of the night sky. The music in this movement is very atmospheric, with lots of subtle orchestration. It starts quite dark and quiet. There's a bass clarinet solo over low strings and a very quiet timpani roll. gradually the music gets brighter. This is like the way that our eyes adjust to the lower light levels. At first the sky just looks black, but the longer you look, the more stars you can see. I've used quite a few different kinds of scales and harmonies in this movement. There are some sections that are just major or minor, but there are also other sections where I jump between unrelated chords, like D major and F major. This kind of harmonic shift helps to create a bit of a sense of wonder. There are also sections in the middle of the movement where I've used something known as the diminished scale, or the octatonic scale. This is built out of an alternating whole tone semitone pattern, so there are actually 8 different notes in the scale, rather than 7 as you would find in, say, the major or minor. It creates a bit more of an atmosphere of suspense and mystery. After spending some time looking at the night sky, we move on to the southern hill of Cronk na Ayres Laa. When composing this final movement, I had a series of images in mind. The first is of a sunrise. An alternative Manx name translates as Hill of the Rising Day, and its panoramic views over the south of the island would give great views of the sunrise. The music starts with a kind of musical sunrise. A French horn solo, which is gradually joined by other instruments in a crescendo that builds to a dramatic climax as the sun rises over the horizon and casts its light across the land. The images that follow are of views from the hill. It's an area of upland heath, so you might see it covered in purple heather or fluffy white cotton grass. You can also look out towards South Barrule or down towards Langness. There are a few different paths up Cronk na Ayres Laa. One of them is comparatively easy going, but as you approach the summit, the path takes a sharp left turn and becomes much steeper. I've represented this with a change in pace. There are these deep, heavy chords and a long crescendo that leads up to another dramatic climax. Hopefully this conveys something of the feeling of finally reaching the summit and looking out over these views. The movement ends with an image from the other end of the day. I've seen a couple of different sunsets from the top of Cronk near Arrey Laa, but on one memorable occasion, there was a thick blanket of mist covering the sea and hanging around the hills. The sun cast a wonderful light over the waves of mist before sinking down into the cloud.